I realize people are walking in, and that's great because I'm just jumping the gun here, starting exactly at 12:30. Do we ever start exactly at 12:30? Exactly on time here at the GSD. I want to do that today because I'm so excited about what's going to be unfolding for the next hour and a half with this amazing panel. So we do want to get started because I want to do justice to the introductions, and I want to give people a chance to kind of find their seats, but I'm going to get started with some introductory remarks before we turn it over to all of our esteemed panelists today. First of all, we have the land acknowledgement, which is important for us to kind of recognize. Rather than reading it out loud, because you can read yourself, I also want to say something, a reminder, because this is live streamed. We also have live captioning available for both anybody in here or those of you who are listening online. So those online can click closed captioning icon at the bottom of the screen of the live stream window. And if anybody in this audience needs some live streaming, please visit the AV Matt, our famous AV booth, mobile AV booth, because he's here in the corner. Also want to just say something about the upcoming events. This is there's always a million amazing events at the GSD, so I'm just giving you a little heads up about some that are next week. We send announcements around, but on Tuesday, October 15th, Theodore Spiropoulos will explore the intersections of quantum physics, artificial intelligence, and second-order cybernetics in pursuit of a theory of relationality. And yeah, you can come back for that. We can talk about that through the lens of the right to the city. And then on Thursday, October 17th, Sean Godsell will transport us to the hot, dry Australian outback, discussing his architectural practice under the dreamy, half-real skies of the quote-unquote bush. That just gives you a little bit of just two moments of the range of amazing things that we all engage with here at the Graduate School of Design, which is a rich environment with many different disciplines represented. And I'm going to be coming back to that when I introduce our panel today. So for more information about those events or others, you can see the lineup of upcoming events on the GSD website. Also, before I go to a more formal introduction, I just also want to send a huge thanks and shout out to Sarah Raffson, Ken Stewart, his entire staff, Ann Whiteside-Baird, who helped us with the event the other day. To get these three kind of consecutive events together in this week has been a lot of work and effort. We have such an amazing team here at the GSD, so I want to give a round of applause to all the staff that's helped with this. You know, the memos and the check-ins and the ordering, and everybody has been so helpful, so thank you so much. So, as those of you who were with us last night in Piper Auditorium to attend the powerful and thought-provoking lecture by Michael Sandel on democracy's discontent, no, we are here today to continue that conversation. That was the promise at the end of our talk, of our evening together last night. The conversation last night, even, that Michael addressed, was inspired by our desire to celebrate the release of the book Democracy, this, dare I say, adorable little book called Democracy and Urban Form by Richard Sennett. It's a co-publication of the Harvard Design Press and Sternberg Press, and it brings together a series of 6 lectures that our friend and honorary member of the GSD always, back then, and past, present, and future, gave at the GSD in 1981. And those lectures addressed a very different political climate than the climate that Michael Sandel was speaking about last night. But he dives deeply into the connections between democracy and justice, matters of architecture, and urban design. The growth of cities a great interest of my own, cosmopolitanism, inclusion, free speech, and other related matters that are just as relevant today, and we're going to hear more about that from Richard in just a second. So copies of the book, I just want to say the copies of the book are available for sale in the library afterwards, and I think Richard will be signing books, so just so you know, you can get a copy later. But getting back to the current program, our aim in this panel for the next hour and a half or so is to build on some of the ideas and provocations posed by Michael Sandel about the crisis of democracy, but to add some of the other important dimensions that were less developed by Michael, who is a political philosopher, namely those having to do with space, architecture, design, and cities as much as nations. These are all elements that join us together as faculty and students at the GSD, and the wide-ranging way of understanding democracy, justice, equity, citizenship, or even conflict, and their spatial manifestations is well represented among this panel today. And so I'm going to dive right into the introductions of the backgrounds of these people so you see where they're coming from before we start our conversation. After the introductions, we'll turn the mic over to Richard, who will start us off with some bridging remarks from yesterday to today, but also a little more attention paid to the amazing material in your book. And then after Richard makes remarks, we'll move to comments, kind of do a round robin of comments by the other panelists, either on Richard's remarks or on the way their own work engages with Richard or Michael's provocations or anything that relates to the larger theme of democracy, space, form, and justice. We'll do one round, and hopefully we have a time to do 2 rounds between us. So I ask all our commentators to be as brief as you can be, but to make the points you want to make. I see my role in this round robin as the moderator, but as those of you who know me, I will probably ask a question or stick my positionality in there somewhere or drive a difference or a conflict or something like that. So without further ado, let me just introduce our panelists. And I think I'm going to be introducing them alphabetically. So first we have Markus Miessen. And we were lucky enough to have Markus give an amazing presentation in the library on Tuesday. So Markus is an architect and writer, and in 2021 was appointed the professor of urban regeneration at the University of Luxembourg, where he holds the chair of the City of Esch. He's previously taught at the AA in London, at the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam, has been a Harvard GSD Fellow, and has held professorships at Stadtschule Frankfurt and the University of USC in Los Angeles. He received his PhD from the Center for Architecture at Goldsmiths College, London, supervised by Isle Weissman. And his work revolves around questions of critical spatial practice, institution building, and spatial justice. His recent book, which he presented, called Agonistic Assemblies on the Spatial Politics of Horizontality, is an amazing book. I might say, of course, he was nice enough to allow me to put one small piece in there, but really wonderful piece of work that some of you have already seen, and I encourage you to kind of get a copy. It came out of work he did as a scholar here at the GSD. Also worked with cultures on cultures of assembly, and has just done a lot of projects. One of his books, which I love, is called The Nightmare of Participation. I say that in being a sociologist in a planning program, and cross-benching, and edited other volumes like Para-Platforms on the Spatial Politics of Right-Wing Populism. So I'll stop there. But there's more. You can find it also on the website. So second, we have Miguel Robles-Duran, born in La Ciudad de Mexico, an urbanist, theorist, designer, educator, and podcaster known for his transdisciplinary approach to urbanization. Combining urban political economy, Marxist political economy, and critical human geography, Miguel serves as a tenured associate professor of urbanism at the New School, Parsons School of Design in New York, where he directs the graduate urban programs. Before his 2010 appointment at the new school, Robles-Duran held academic positions at TU Delft, the Berlage Institute, and Zurich University of the Arts. And you guys had, apparently when we had dinner last night, you had run into, you'd worked together in Europe. So small, we didn't really know that even when we organized this panel, so that's great. Alongside David Harvey, Miguel has co-founded Urban Front, well, along with David, who has been here a couple years back. He co-founded Urban Front, a transnational consultancy working with progressive governments in urban justice initiatives, including, I've just heard, with the new mayor of Mexico City, Clara Brugada. So I'm so excited to see what you guys are doing down there. And he is a founder, he has co-founded Politics in Motion, an anti-capitalist media organization where he hosts the podcast Cities After, which I've seen several versions of, and it's great. His forthcoming book is called Cohabitation Strategies, Challenging Neoliberal Urbanization Between Crises. So I'm sure we're going to hear his views on last night's discussion as well, among so many other articles and publications and active projects. Richard Sennett, maybe needs little introduction, but there are some things about Richard that are so important to continue to remind us new things he's done, as well as his long history and tradition of teaching in design schools and in sociology departments. So he currently serves as the chair of the UN Habitat Urban Initiatives Group. He's a senior fellow at the Center on Capitalism and Society at Columbia University, and a visiting professor of urban studies at MIT. And previously, he founded the New York Institute for the Humanities, taught at NYU and the London School of Economics, and served as president of the American Council on Work. I should also say he grew up in Cabrini Green in Chicago. I know that. I don't think it was in here. So he knows cities and architecture and modern design from the inside and out. His books include The Hidden Injuries of Class, The Fall of Public Man, which you used in my public seminar, The Corrosion of Character, The Culture of the New Capitalism, The Craftsman, as well as Building and Dwelling. He has a book on performance that we announced. We had an event last year, and of course now he's the author of this book that's available for you. So we're really excited that you're at the center of these events, Richard. And finally, last but not least, Claire Zimmerman, an associate professor at the John Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto. She received her PhD from the City University of New York, her MArch here from Harvard, and her Bachelor of Arts from the University of Pennsylvania. From 2006 to 2013, she served as an assistant and then associate professor of architectural history and theory at the Taubman College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Michigan. And in her work, Claire focuses on protocols, this is a quote, protocols of modernization and modernity in architecture and the built environment. She's taught about the effects of mass production and mass reproduction, reading architectural photography and industrial building against prevailing narratives of the profession and the academy, but also in relation to users and public audiences. So publics are key in her work as well. And I would also add that among her recent and forthcoming books are a co-edited book called Architecture Against Democracy, which is one of the main reasons we were really excited you've come back to join us today, and a new book, Albert Kahn Incorporated, Architecture, Labor, and Industry, 1905 to 1961. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Richard.
Thank you. Well, thank you. This is an amazing event. I'm really happy to have come. It's also a slightly sad event for me because it reminds me that when I gave these lectures, at the time I gave these lectures in 1981, I realized that I had made the wrong choice in my life, that I shouldn't have become a sociologist, I should have become an architect. And that's what I said to you when I'm a recovering sociologist. And the reason for that is in a way something I'd just like to explore with you tonight, which is I became more and more interested in the mobilizing power of architecture rather than its representational forms. That is, how can architecture actually enable a certain kind of political experience rather than simply represent what is analytically. And I'm going to try and explain in 7 minutes and 35 seconds, I promise no more, one thing that has come to me about that, which also, one way in which that it's true, which comes out of long-standing friendship that I had with Henri Lefebvre. And it is simply that when we think about democracy in urban form, what we should be thinking about is the right to the city, which is, of course, Lefebvre's famous book. Here are, these are the original. David Harvey's essay on it and his elaboration of it, the best and most concise writing is this article from New Left Review, and I'd recommend that as a kind of entry point into this whole issue. The thing about Lefebvre was that in a way he believed in architecture, but in my view he had a very deficient view of architectural form. It's just my own view, and it was one that was developed with numerous discussions and fights with him about the possibility that architectural form could actually be mobilizing for politics. So I thought I would do in this 7 minutes and 38 seconds is explain to you 3 ways in which I think architectural form can actually be mobilizing for democracy of a very particular sort, the sort that I'm writing about in my book, which is a democracy of bodies, not a discursive democracy, but a democracy of relationship between human beings in space, so that people become more aware of and recognizing of people who differ from themselves. That's the basis of all my urbanism, is the notion of making, as I put it in one book, people aware of themselves as one among many, which I think cities can do. And that is a kind of democracy of the body. Now, it's not what Michael was talking about last night, but it sits next to it as the physical embodiment of the ability to recognize the other. So I just thought I'd show you 3 ways in which I thought this could be. The first has to do with the issue of porosity, and that's what porosity looks like in a city. This is Dharavi in Mumbai. It was a slum. It's all gentrified now. But it's porous vertically, and that people on the ground are mostly working or shopping, and they're living above where they work. They're on the ground. This is a basket-making center, and so this is also a productive space. And this is porosity as it exists in New York, something closer to us. In the ground plane of these buildings, tenement buildings. I took this at 5 in the morning in the summer because by 7 you couldn't see any of this. It's crowded with people. And that, it seems to me, is something about the kind of way in which democracy of the body works in New York City, that there's a very porous relationship between the inside and the outside. And of course, planning and architecture can shut it down. Here's a little further up in 3rd Avenue. This was when I was in the planning commission. This is a way of shutting down the ground plane. So what we really need to do as planners, if we want people to have that sense of being one among many, is to do this kind of planning where there are lots of non-related activities happening at the ground plane, all open at the same time. So porosity, I would say, is an element of urban form absolutely necessary for the experience in a city of being one amongst many. Here, if this works, we can only see, this is the design of porosity done by my student and friend Hashem Sarkis, who taught here for a long time. This is a school in Lebanon. This is all very sad this month. Post, as we thought, Civil War, and the school was built during the time of the Civil War to protect students, but in Hashem's mind the notion that architecture could open this up once peace came to Lebanon, and here's how he did it. It actually works. And you see what he's done on the elements of this, so the children feel that they are, rather than in a kind of fortress, protecting them from violence, that the elements are such that they can be easily moved. And in fact, I don't have a picture of this, but that's the principle of it, that all these elements can just physically be trundled out to create an open, a porous form. So I believe we can design porosity, and that we can do it as in this case, a very civilized, very sophisticated way. The second issue, which seems to me to be critical to establishing the right to the city, is informality. And here I'm going to show you, this looks like it's a totally formal space, which can be altered simply. This is the same space every weekend by infills like this, and now it's filled with people. But what I want you to think about more is Nehru Place in Delhi. This is actually, you're looking at, if I press this, I'll probably put somebody's eyes out. Oh, God, it doesn't matter. This is actually the roof of a parking garage. And when it was originally designed, it was supposed to be an empty space, and the building on the side was government offices. The government fled. The parking garage roof was colonized by people who are selling illegal or semi-legal electronics. And the people, if you want to buy a new iPhone in Delhi, you head to Nehru Place. And the people on the side are now small IT and tech innovators who have basically squatted this building. And the thing about this that has to do with the right to the city is not only the capacity to get space that you're supposed not to use, but what you can't see here is that the space on the top of the parking garage, underground parking garage, has all of this electronic equipment being sold by both Muslims and Hindus. This is one of and they work together. They're competitors in the terms of what, you could buy a stolen iPhone 16 from a Muslim, or you could buy it from a Hindu. But this is one of the most peaceful parts of Delhi, because these traders are mixed physically together. Planning, again, can screw this up. This is the beginning of the so-called renovation of this, in which, unfortunately, the UN Habitat before my time helped fund. You can already see that it's cleaned up and that it's losing its informal life. So when we're thinking about the right to the city, it's this kind of informal spaces that we want to protect rather than renew. The third aspect of this, and this is the most important thing I have to say to you, is about the phenomenon of adjacency, something Henri never thought about very much. What is the next to like? I'm going to give you an instance of this about what I mean by adjacency in showing you do you all know these Aldo van Eyck parks that he created in Amsterdam after the war? Well, this is one of them. It's a non-adjacent space. You can see that there's a lot of empty space for cars and so on. Aldo did this. He put in a fill of so that people could use it. The most important thing about it is that this was a space for children, which was right next to, this is a very traffic-heavy part of Amsterdam. And the notion was that the children, as he said, would have to learn how to keep safe. That planning wouldn't put up a wall here. I mean, if you were doing this in New York City, this would be all barbed wire or high, some kind of high fence. Whereas his notion was that children, in learning how to play in the city, had to learn how to manage conditions which were adjacent to them, which could be potentially dangerous to them. We call that street smarts in New York. Maybe you don't call it that up here in Boston. But it is a profound principle about how right to the city works, which is that right to the city assumes that people get the knowledge of how to use the city, and they develop it through experience in places which are, it's not a porous space, but it's an unmarked edge. It's a particular kind of edge. And the larger dimension for something like that is that when we create more of those spaces, we are creating more of an experience for people physically that where they learn that they are one among many, that they have to reorient themselves to things which are not safe, not secure, and that gradually they develop the kind of competency, urban competency, which applied to space can also be applied to people. That's the logic of this. What I saw from this is that this principle that he had about children learning how to play in a city could also be approached the way adults deal with each other in the street and within institutions, that the zoning and boundary markings are not evident. That's an argument we could have about identity as well. So anyhow, these are, for me, pretty much sparked by the beginning of this book, 3 ways that I began to think about what the right to the city means, the democracy of the body. It's something that can be planned by planning porosity, by encouraging rather than discouraging informality, and most of all, by seeking out kind of means of giving people this experience of adjacency. So that's where I wound up from this book.
Perfect segue to Miguel. Well, I was going to say 2 things. The segue, obviously, is working with David Harvey. So maybe you'll say a little something about whether you're recovering, like Richard's a recovering sociologist, but also you don't have to respond to this, but it is for us to think about one of the questions that has been filtering through my mind for today is the global context. Because yesterday was so much about the U.S., but your examples from Mumbai and other places make us think that this is a question, a global question. So, onward.
No, thank you, Richard. That's a lot to respond to. But I mean, I want to start first. Thank you very much for everyone. It's so great to see Markus again, and to be with Richard and Diane, Claire. You started with saying, well, when I'm here, I'm sad. Right, and I wish I would have studied architecture. When I have the chance to speak in an architecture panel or in an architecture school, I kind of think the opposite, actually. Right, it kind of reassures me that even though I studied originally architecture, that the path that I have taken towards not so much what we would consider architecture. It's much more reassuring, right? But at the same time, I have to say that it's a bit sad to think that the majority of architecture schools around the world have not changed dramatically since I studied, and I didn't have the opportunity to study at Harvard or in the United States by any means. I mean, you were saying I'm Mexican, so I studied in a university which I'm not going to say names because it's live streamed, but the time that I was studying, that was early '90s. It was a very particular moment in time, and I think architecture hadn't changed either that much, in which the emphasis on form, which is what Richard is just bringing up, was something that I just could never understand, right? I have to tell a little bit of the tale of what was my interest in, why did I start architecture? I grew up in Mexico City, but then I moved to Tijuana, right? And I'm sure you've heard what Tijuana is, right? When I moved to Tijuana, it was not the kind of city that you think it was, right? Tijuana was considered to be the most prosperous city in Mexico at the time of one huge economic crisis in the 80s, in the early 80s in '82, because of the American policy. But independently of any of that, when I moved there, it was a crappy city. It still is. I mean, it's not a very beautiful city whatsoever. But it didn't have the image that you guys would think it, when you think of Tijuana, right now. Crime, I mean, poverty, slums everywhere, all of that kind of stuff. And when I, started living there, which must have been in the early 80s, until I left, I saw this dramatic transformation, like precisely everything that you hear right now about Tijuana happened in a period of 10, 12 years where the city just became absolutely something else. And it was just getting uglier and uglier and uglier. And I've always had a little I was sensible to, I live in quite an ugly place, especially when I went back to Mexico City. And Mexico City, those of you that have been there, I think it's absolutely beautiful, right? So I was visiting family in Mexico City and then coming back to Tijuana, I was just like, what is this, right? And then at some point, it caught up to me. It's like, I have to do something, right? And so I went and studied architecture. Because I guess, naive, stupid, young person of me thought that architecture could actually do something to better the urban environment, right? It took long for me to realize that was not the case, right? And I still believe that. You guys could tell me the opposite, right? But it has been quite a ride. Now, in terms of being part of an architecture school where, I was emphasized that architecture mattered, that form mattered that much, into stopping to believe in that, into realizing that architecture in itself can be mobilized either for democracy or for authoritarianism. Right? That architecture in itself is more representative of the political and social and economic dynamics of the time in which it's occupying, which is a little bit contrary to perhaps what Aldo Rossi at some point actually said, the memory of the city, the buildings, and so forth. But when I started working more in urban fields and trying to learn from other disciplinary apparatuses, realizing that yes, you could go into a non-porous space that I've been in many. For example, I remember the first time I went to Venezuela it was in the early 2000s, at what some people would consider kind of the golden age of Chavez. if there was ever one, but that's not to be argued here. You know, there were these huge warehouses which were non-porous, right? I mean, like complete the form. But the way in which the government sort of utilized those spaces made them the most dynamic, amazing spaces for families and children and so forth. Similarly, one could be in the most porous space, right? And at the same time, it could be the most repressive sort of kind of condition and regime or whatever, right? Now, I'm not arguing that architecture is useless in that stage. I think architecture does contribute, without doubt, into facilitating the dimensions of the political, social, economic dynamics in which all of us are involved in. What I find more appalling about the contemporary state of the architecture practice, and I think contemporary since I started working until now, is that the facilitation of the discipline has clearly been, you know, skewed, heavily skewed, towards facilitating the type of, I would say, non-democratic structures that we right now are discussing and we discussed yesterday. I want to pair this up with your concept of informality, but you didn't define informality, but for me, informality is that has not been captured by the market, right? And if we, and I want to make this kind of like push, not push, but like a provocation, that perhaps what you're arguing in informality is precisely the spaces that could permit a certain democratic sort of autonomous arrangement of self-governance and self-dictation in which the market doesn't, you know, impose its pervasive sort of classifications of who can actually access a space and who can't, right? Or who owns and who doesn't, or who has the legitimate use over a specific kind of space. When I read informality, I also get like very excited every time I'm in informal elements, and not to romanticize, of course, a lot of things that happen in there, but the tendency in which most even left-leaning governments in the 90s and 2000s has been to formalize. I mean, and formalize again means, for me, perhaps for you means something else, capturing by the market. You know, it reminds me of these sociologists in the 90s, that Swiss-Peruvian guy, Hernando Soto, no? When he came to the World Bank and he basically says, you know, look, all of these people in Peru living in slums, they don't realize they're millionaires, they're rich. And the only thing they have to do is just legalize their land, right? And they could just sell it, and they're sitting in millions of dollars, and it's just like, we have to legalize this. We've known how that has turned. And it was not difficult to imagine how that has turned, right? And so I think if I have to contribute, if I want to contribute something into this dynamic, is to extend or to provide a proposition in which one can think about architecture and democracy as something that is not related to what we tend to think of architecture as the craft of architecture, but in a way in which you align your practice towards a certain political, economical, or social discourse, right? Which is the thing that I think would make the majority of impact, right? It's not the same, you know, working for Miuccia Prada, right, than working for, I don't know, I mean, something else. Like I said, even UN, Habitat, or whatever you want to say, right? It's not the same working for a specific kind of government in Russia and develop a park that you claim to be, you know, the next central park, because we know, you know, Dealers Cofidia, for example, did that park in Russia. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, claiming that it will bring democracy into Moscow, right? And washing it with those kinds of agendas, which are completely absurd, right? If you really think about it, the reality is that, you know, they're completely a type of practice that is non-reflective in what kind of power structures you're serving for. So my interest in architecture does not fall so much in the development of form, but in which way all of you and all architects take, you know, more critical decisions as to where to embed your energies and the kind of work that you're doing. And that way, no matter if you like postmodern language and you want to produce like another Duck or like Venturi, because that was what I was studying when I was studying architecture, or if you want to do something like Sejima or whatever. I mean, I honestly think it's rather irrelevant, but in the context that we are in, right? What is relevant is how you actually develop, I guess, a certain character to basically work for those things that don't want to be captured by the market, right? And that requires a completely different, type of practice in which I believe that architecture schools don't emphasize too much. So I want to stop there as a response to this. Thank you.
Otherwise, we're not going to get our second round.
So-
But,
so-
we need some good provocation.
So I'm going to tell you at 7, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay. So I may not go on that long. We'll see. So I want to try to have some continuity from person to person. So hopefully I'll leave you, Markus, in a place where you can pick up. But I think as you were speaking, Miguel, I was thinking, how does our effort fit into this? And it is, I think, an effort to be more specific, to be more concrete about what we mean when we talk about architecture and democratic practices. So I'm here to talk about a book. So I'm going to give you a kind of description of this book, which unfortunately I don't have physically here, sadly, and then give you a few takeaways from that book. And talk about what follows. I will save I have very specific comments on Richard's amazing lectures. It's just so amazing to read these in 2024. But I would save those comments, I think, for the second round, if that's okay. Yeah, okay. So the book that I am here to talk about is called Architecture Against Democracy, Histories of the Nationalist International. And it's a project I co-edited with Reinhold Martin at Columbia. It came out of Reinhold's work as the director of the Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture. And we worked on this for many years. We had a series of in-person workshops in New York, culminating in the last one, which took place on March 8th, 2020. I got on a plane to go back to Athens, where I was living with my husband, and I promptly fell into bed with what I think must have been COVID, although we didn't know at the time. So that was the moment when everything shut down. So we finished our in-person workshops, thankfully, by that point. And I want to read the names of the authors of this book, because neither Reinhold nor I wrote a chapter. We wrote the introduction and the conclusion, and we wrote the covering, the sort of organizing frames for the book, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So the authors, in the order in which they appear in the book, are Mabel Wilson. Some of these names you'll know well and some you won't, but I want to acknowledge them all, particularly the ones whose names you don't know. So Mabel Wilson, Naomi Vaughn, Ruth Lowe, Jose Bortolucci, Kishwar Rizvi, Paul Jaskett and Eve Duffy, Itohan Osayimwese, Maria Gonzalez Pendas, Ana Maria Leon, who is here, Nader Vasogian, Laura Di Zarega, Pete Minoche, Charles Davis II, Esra Akjan, and John Bilsell. An amazing group of 15 people. It was an incredible privilege to work with them and to have back and forth over the course of these workshops and developing these essays. And we, Reinhold and I, organized the book in 3 segments. The first one on hegemony, that is to say, coercion with consent. What does that mean in the context of the built environment? The second, technocracy, ideologies of expertise. And the third one was titled Democracy, Perennially Deferred, ? And each of those has a covering essay that explains its logic. So I'll give you a few takeaways from this book, and maybe they will resonate with what we've already heard, I hope. And then I'll stop for now and continue later with comments on Richard's lectures. The first takeaway from our studies, and these are very targeted, very historically specific studies. They were meant to be close readings of particular situations by people with expertise in those areas. So it's a particular kind of book. It's very detailed and very case specific. But generally, the takeaways are pretty obvious, I think, but I'll say them anyway. Architecture can become powerfully political in a kind of positive sense, in the positive sense that we are, I think, aiming for today, only in tandem with human activity or human action. So there's some sort of catalytic event or chain of events that brings architecture into this kind of positive political valence. And I think those generally, or often anyway, have to do with a kind of refunctioning or unintended function that is latent in architectural things, in spaces. So that the first point, it can happen, but in my experience, there's a kind of catalytic spur that makes space become a site of democratic action. The second is that the built environment is always politically charged, just not always in ways we might like or ways we acknowledge. And part of our reason for putting together Architecture Against Democracy was to try to become a bit more precise about how we think this is true, how built environments are inherently political in some way or other, and how the capacity to read that is crucial, which we don't always have, regardless of whether we're architects or not architects. So in Architecture Against Democracy, we sought out both of these situations, the situation in which some kind of catalytic change renders an environment positively politically charged, and the ways in which built environments are always, in some way or other, political. Going from our discussions last night and from the lecture last night, I would say the politics of places was what we sought to read and make more legible to our readers. Our operating hypothesis is that the evidence is there, but it's not always easy to recognize. Not because people can't read buildings. I don't think that's true. That people can't read buildings, architects can. I do not believe that to be the case. In fact, I think sometimes architects are the worst people at reading the built environment. It's not because people can't read buildings and architects can. It's because the built environment has been already naturalized in most situations. Not, say, in the case of something like EUR, or if you go to Ataturk's tomb outside of Ankara, not when it's totally obvious or heavy-handed, but even in those situations, I would argue, it isn't usually effective in the ways that were intended when it was designed. The reason is it's naturalized. There is no counter-proposition to a constructed building. There's no other reality. There's no alternative prospect. Once you build something, it becomes in some way accepted as part of a physical reality that is difficult, if not impossible, to change. And I just would not underestimate the effects of that naturalization process that is part of what we do. So I'm going to stop there. I want to say that this project has been followed for me by a much more ambitious, really, in a certain way. Well, less ambitious, more complicated project on the costs of architecture, on what we spend on the built environment, and in trying to correlate that with the aesthetic effects of built environments. And that is a huge project, it needs many, many people involved in it, and I'm happy to talk more about it, but that's where I'm going since this book. Okay.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. I will try to break the record of being very short. So I made a couple of notes that are based on last night's lecture and also what we discussed during the dinner. I think this was a brilliant ending, saying that it requires a lot of people from different disciplines, and I think one of the really fantastic realities about the GSD is that actually we have a lot of these people in the room from very different, let's say, sectors or sections of spatial planning or spatial design at large. And I think for me, one of the main questions that came out of last night is, how can this actually all be designed? So all the questions that we're talking around, all the questions that came up, they are at the end also questions about how that kind of other spatial reality can be generated. And I would actually really like to propose in this context that we replace the term architecture with the term design, because this is also something that very much relates to this place. And I think maybe in certain ways it could be explored more, let's say. So one of the things I noticed is that although there's all these great people in the room and there's all these great kind of sections of the GSD, also some people don't really tend to talk to one another. So this is one thing that I would very much like to promote. I think also there's since it's a school of design, I think we're talking very much about questions around scale and questions of impact. And I think that's also where it's even more important to rethink architecture as something that is design related, and where design actually becomes rather, let's say, a kind of attitude rather than the, let's say, product of a practice. Because, of course, architecture suggests such a product of a practice. I think also one thing that was, for me, very important yesterday was that, thinking of all these realities that were brought up in the talk, and also all the realities that we're facing at the moment where, in many places of the world, the reality is really burning at the moment. It's extremely important that we remain somehow optimistic, and I think this optimism can arise from a kind of propositional mode, or thinking propositionally rather than feeling like one is being stuck within the reality that we're facing. And that brings me to the question of role. So this is something that I'm often thinking when talking in the context of architecture schools, and let's say in the context of architects in general, because most of us in architecture are not really, let's say, considering the larger societal questions, but are really planning for the 1%. And that's also something that very much relates to what Miguel was coming up with in terms of this question of what I would call policy rather than jewelry. So I'm personally very much interested in how different forms of design can have different scales of impact. And so what interests me at the moment very much is the question of how, for example, through policy recommendations, one can have a larger effect in terms of the built environment than working with, let's say, either individual clients or on individual projects. And maybe I'll end with the question, what constitutes a common infrastructure? Thank you very much.
Great. These are wonderful comments, and I know I want to be able to save a little time for some questions from the audience, but I do want to do one more go through. And I think that what I want to propose, building on things that all of you have said, I'm thinking about time and history. I guess it came into my mind when Clara said, well, later I'll talk about Richard's book that was written in 1981. So, yet if we think back to the lecture last night, there was an evolution. Michael gave us a discussion about the path dependency, shall we say, of how we got from a more vibrant to a less vibrant democracy or something like that. So the issue of temporality is kind of one thing that I want to think about. I'm also I love the use of the word design rather than architecture. But so my question for everybody is to think a little bit more, and again, taking the opportunity of Richard's book, about how do you think about the challenges of designing democracy, shall we say, or the challenges of democracy now in 2024, as opposed to maybe 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And I also want to say that it builds on Miguel's comment that architecture schools, and that's a generalization, and there are variations, and we might be leaders, we might be not in these things, but it is true that architecture education hasn't changed that much. Claire, you were saying that earlier. So education hasn't changed, but the world has changed. and the discussion last night. This is the dilemma. The world has changed, and that's why we're in the crisis of democracy. So I would like to ask you, just to repeat the question, how are you thinking about designing democracy now as opposed to when you started out, or as some moment in the past? You picked the most moment in the past. You might talk about 81. And just a variation of that question, just since it'll be just one more go through, is, well, maybe not a variation, but I'd love if you wanted you to pay attention to the scale at which you're designing democracy, because you've talked about entire regimes, right? Yet some people are talking about a street corner. So again, if you want to say something, do we work at the same scales now that we did 20 years ago? Is scale part of the new design, or is it just a new sets of agencies, new structures, et cetera? So that's the question, and we'll start with Richard. Small question.
Gosh.
Or anything that.
No, but I'm slow-witted, so, you know. I mean, when I've taught here, what I have been interested in with students is how, I guess you can put this very crudely, how adaptable buildings are over the course of time. And the buildings that I've worked on with students here are not private housing, where this question is usually posed, or how to turn an office tower into a set of residences, but how to take things like schools, and particularly hospitals, into ways in which that the built form evolves coherently, but evolves as knowledge progresses, or as people are taught differently. This is a very concrete and, again, very sad focus for me, in that I worked on projects in Gaza for building hospitals that could evolve as both more resources came into Gaza, and as the hospitals were serving more people. These are all destroyed now, but it's that's a kind of way in which I've thought about this. How do you make a form like a ward, so that if it holds 40 people, it can hold 140, if the need be, or if technology makes that possible. The problem with this, which you all know in the abstract, is the notion that, as you say, that a finished object is there, it's naturalized. And usually the add to, the way in which it evolves in time is that there's addition rather than reconfiguration. What's so interesting about the school that Hashem designed in Lebanon is that it has a different quality, it has a different way of evolving in time, which is that the parts can be reconfigured and opened up very simply. It's really just tracks to do it. So that's, I guess, my answer to your question.
Let me ask you quickly, you wrote the essays, just so I'll give you a second round because we're here to talk about your book. So the way you were thinking about designing our democracy in 81, when you were writing these lectures, is that different than you're thinking about it now?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll send it on the yeah.
No. No, I've always believed that democracy has, as a political principle, has more to do with address to the stranger than it does about community. To me, the New England town meeting it's democratic, but it's not significantly democratic in the way that I think urbanists need to think about this. That in a city, the question is, how do people relate to strangers? And that's why there's very little in my writing about, I love communities, I flourish in them and so on, but I don't think they're foundation of democracy. since you asked
No,
me.
that's great.
And I've continued to believe that for 45 years. So,
Excellent. Well, we'll hear from the rest of the panelists, and then maybe we'll open out because people might also want to ask questions. So, Miguel.
No, thank you. I will try to address all the questions. I guess the first one, because the one that you just pointed out to Richard, has it changed? And I think for me, yes, dramatically, right? I think what has changed the most is that the more I dig in the past histories of what I learned to be a democratic environment, for example, Brasilia or Mexican modernism, in which we tend to emphasize a certain, like quality of public spaces. For example, when we were talking about Lina Bobardi, and the sort of space in Sao Paulo, the museum, that I remember going to many lectures where this was talked about, spaces that would produce democracy. Now, the more you dig into this, and I'm talking specifically about the case of Brazil in this sense, because I was just with a friend from Sao Paulo. His name is Paulo Tavares, and we were discussing a lot of the research that he's been doing. And then the research that he was doing is that in the great majority of these sites, and it includes the sites in which Lina Bobardi actually was very active, there was a very, very hard way of applying anti-democratic structures in order to make those possible. In the sites of Brazil and so on, there were destructions of originary or indigenous people's lives in order to produce this type of, idea of a new democratic modernist society, right? And if we go like a little bit deeper into the forms in which architecture gets isolated from the origins or the process that ended up building these kinds of things, then yes, I would say that we would go into a discussion whether, Lina Bobardi's space is actually democratic or not, right? Or Oscar Niemeyer's or whatever. But if we look at the process, again, the political, economic, and social context in which these new forms of modernism were being brought, I find them very problematic, actually incredibly problematic. Specifically when we are discussing, I still believe, because I have a lot of contacts with indigenous groups in South America and also in Mexico, that their forms of living, for example, were hugely much more democratic than any form of Western sort of transported, imposed types of what we call now democracy. Right? And so it is very painful for me to realize that a lot of these sort of things that we revere as spaces of democratic, whatever, are actually the opposite. There were spaces where there was tremendous violence, against things that we would have learned much more. And again, in all of these, in that favor of the market growth. I mean, yes, even those spaces where, a very pro-capitalist, pro-growth, sort of directions that many of these South American countries were having. And so, yes, I mean, that has changed a lot. So every time I look at a space, and when we talk about democracy and the production of democracy, again, it's trying to do an analysis of what are you working for? Who are you working for? I mean, Lefebvre used to have those questions very clear, who is it for? What is it for? For whom? Right? It's like he places those questions repeatedly in many of his books. And those are questions that I think the majority of designers tend to forget, right? And that includes, of course, discussion we're having yesterday about, should we go back into some kind of welfare structure? And I have to remind people that American welfare structures or European welfare structures were based on the plundering of my people from the South, right? And the richness didn't just arrive, it was taken. Right? And so also to think about spaces globally, which some people have the privilege, right? That we can have the luxury of like, yes, let's revive, welfare and so forth, while, the rest of the world is not. I find it also very problematic. And that turns into the questions of scale, right? The question of scale is, I think, perhaps one of the most important, because we don't know how to connect them. So yes, I work with national governments and I work with municipal governments most of the time. And yes, we discuss, major policy shifts that could, I guess, have repercussions into hundreds of thousands or millions of people, depends on what we're talking about. But what we find is that you cannot apply these policies if you don't have people that are working in every single scale with a similar sort of mode of thinking, in which if you want to dedicate your life to design the small neighborhood street, right, that person should be connected with those other scales and vice versa, right? That all of these are components of a very important project of bringing, I guess, whatever we want to call democracy today, because that's also something very contested. I don't think we have time to discuss in this case. I mean, democracy, Western capitalist, European colonial form of democracy, for me, is not my kind of democracy. But other people would argue something different, right? So, but in this case, that scale issue is something that is very relevant. And when you're talking about the types of changes that need to happen in architecture schools, I think we suffer a lot when we try to hire, let's say, people that work in some of our projects. And when we start talking to architects, that the architect doesn't have an idea how the other scales work, right, at all. And actually not even an idea, not even an interest, right, in which other scales work. And that is very problematic, because then we are isolating, the disciplinary apparatuses that need to be coordinated, because it's impossible to apply everything at a policy level. You can create the most incredible policies. I mean, Ecuador has the right to the city in the Constitution. It has not been possible, right? I mean, the Bolivia and Ecuador have also the right to nature, right? Look at the extractivist sort of projects continuing there. So that is a very problematic thing. Now, I want to conclude in this second round, I know I'm taking long, that my take on what the future democratic sort of development of spaces should be for is that if we look at the history of, capitalist sort of dimensions of the 20th century, 21st century, we had a very good moment, which we're talking about in certain countries, which was the welfare, where the state was providing people things. I honestly think that is not a model that we should follow, but we can discuss this. And then we had neoliberalism, where all the power and resources were taken from the state into private enterprises, which we're pretty much there, whatever you want to call late stage or whatever. Our sort of direction in Urban Front, and this organization that I started with other friends, is to go towards the idea of developing public collective or public communitarian partnerships in which governmental structures, discussing with them, are able to secede power in the decision-making of citizens to build their own environment, which is closer to, of course, David Harvey's sort of definition of the right to the city. So the secession of power, the cessation of decision-making is also something that's very difficult in the architecture world, obviously, right? I mean, like in Mexico, you could go to the Barragan house, right? And the Barragan people that are giving you the tour are telling you with great pride that Barragan would never allow, it made you sign a contract that you could not change, right, at all, otherwise you would be sued, that kind of thing. So there's a whole sequence of that, but I would put it there. Thank you. Yes.
So I'm going back to the original question, but I kind of want to go from what Miguel was saying, that I in the course of last night's lecture, I was coming to the conclusion that North America or the United States is not the place for democracy anymore. It's kind of gone here, actually, I think. But elsewhere in the world, I think there are possibilities for democracy, in part based on aiming for something that you want, that you don't have. Here, we've sort of made it impossible to conduct practices democratically. And if you want to see the sort of limit case of this, only because I'm addicted to the crossword puzzle do I ever read the New York Times Magazine. But last weekend, there's an article about what's happening in Texas, and it's kind of a demonstration of the limit case of of the United States today. So I'm not sure that the way I think about democracy today and the way that I used to think about it are different from the mainstream. In other words, there was a different expectation when my career started. And I would say about that when I was here as a student, I don't think I thought about democracy at all. I was too busy thinking about other things that were being pressed upon me. But I did think about democracy closer to the time when Richard gave his lectures, because I was a student at the University of Pennsylvania, and there was the remnants of a kind of 70s generation who were very focused on vernacular architecture and human rights, really. So I sort of lost that when I came to Harvard for a while, but it did resurface. Just as I think the United States is not a good place to pursue democracy any longer, I don't think that architecture schools on the whole are very good places to pursue any kind of meaningful change in the built environment. And I'm sorry to say that, but I think as a general case, the grip of the studio system is so tight on the schools that it's very, very difficult to get outside it. And unfortunately, the people who qualify for the positions leading design studios are generally not people who actually know anything about the built environment. They know a lot about design, but they don't know anything about politics, typically. That's a harsh thing to say, but I would say I've seen enough cases of this in my career to feel that it is actually true. So, but I want to turn back to the lectures, because I did want to offer these comments on reading the book. There's just so many points of conjuncture in the text with the way we think about the same issues today. It's to me kind of extraordinary that there could be so much that's still relevant, that's still apropos of the present. And then there are some places where we could have a very, very interesting dialogue about how to respond to this book, basically. I agree totally with Richard's statement that the way cities are used encourages or discourages democratic processes. I think that's absolutely true. I would add to the definitions of democracy that come from the book and that came last night, just to insist that there's a legal regime that's predicated on representation that is meant to be the guarantor of democracy. And if we forget about that legal regime, we do so at our peril, because it is the only way in which any kind of structural change can still be made. So I would draw attention to the question of legality. Then the notion of cities as concentrations of people for democratic speech, crucially important, but to me that's where we see a change from when the lectures were given and today, which is that, and this was, I think, discussed last night, the city is not our problem any longer. Cities, in fact, maybe cities actually are now the problem in a way that they weren't. In the 80s, the cities were a problem of neglect and poverty. And now cities are problems because they're so wealthy and because they're so stratified, so that if you live in New York City, chances are either you occupy one of the very desirable apartments in Manhattan, or you serve one of them. And I don't think there are a tremendous number of options in between those two. So you have a city of rich and poor and not much in the middle, I think. So I think that's a question, that now the problem of democracy is really not so much a problem of what people do in cities, which has become somewhat anomalous from what they do elsewhere, but what people are doing elsewhere. And particularly, how would you create or encourage or foster democratic processes in the kinds of suburban landscapes that we've built all over this country with their dependence on automobiles? So that, I think, is a much more intractable problem of design, is what do we do about that? And that wasn't true when you gave these lectures. It was a very, very different time. So I'm sort of very affected by Timothy Mitchell's claims about democratic representation, that metropolises came into being to serve industrial capitalism, and that democratic representation was a kind of collateral effect of gathering people together in cities. Democracy was not regarded as a desirable thing, representation that is. In industrial metropolises, it was regarded as a kind of necessary evil, is more or less Mitchell's claim. And yet it produced very, very important structural changes to society. So that's an example of a case where you have something that's put into place for one reason, that when you refunction it, when you adapt it for another purpose, actually it turns out to be quite effective. So I would point to that, to Mitchell's book, and then Andreas Malm's kind of response to that book. To the creation of individuality or individualism as a problem that surfaces in Lecture 3, I would add the question of subject formation or subjectivity. How is it that the built environment shapes subjectivity or subjects? I think is a key question for understanding more about democracy. The city plays a crucial role in the subject formation of city dwellers, a la Simmel or Nietzsche, as Richard has mentioned. But in the cases that are front and center for subject formation in the city, we are thinking about white, European, educated, upper middle class males. And I would turn to someone like Joan Scott or to Carolyn K. Steedman to understand ethnically white women before the voting franchise and what their subjectivity was like, to Bell Hooks, Catherine McKittrick, and Saidia Hartman for a better understanding of the subject formation in dialogue with gender and race, and others for other notions of subjectivity, so that we don't just look at Georg Simmel as our model of an urban subject. And then finally, for the last couple of lectures, I find many very, very interesting resonances with more recent work. The work of Olivier Zunz on the destruction of an ethnic identity in Detroit to turn people into workers. It's a very, very important book. And then in relation to Lecture 5, Esra Akjan's Open Architecture, a book that should be a model to everyone. If you haven't read Esra's book, please read it. It's a wonderful piece of work, methodologically innovative, and absolutely dealing with questions of subject formation in relation to the very architecture that Richard discusses in Lecture 5. So a very, very interesting resonance there. So that's it for me.
So thank you, Claire, for doing a great summary of Richard's book before we end the panel. So we'll have some final comments from Markus, and then we'll open it out for 1 or 2 questions.
So now I have to be the optimistic designer. That's not so easy, but I'll try. Very short. So I haven't lost belief in design, I have to say. That's my little preface. I think the small scale, to continue on your thoughts, Miguel, I think the small scale as an entry point for social zones of friction, that is absolutely crucial. And I think is precisely when we engage on that small scale that it will have, by default, an impact on the larger scale. And I think Richard's example that you showed of the image in Delhi with this kind of informal market was a really brilliant example for this. But I think one thing that's really important from a design point of view to understand as a practitioner is then when we consider these kinds of designs, that we also don't forget that not everything should always be programmed, that we create what I would call kind of support structure of sorts that provides, let's say, possibilities, but that doesn't necessarily provide a kind of fixed program. So in other words, providing the infrastructure for centralized and also decentralized assemblies. And designing, I think, alternative forms of these public support structures will be extremely important in this making of kind of new forms of democracy. That's my end. I'm very fast.
We have 10 minutes for questions. Okay, so why don't we just bundle, I see 1 and 3. Yes, 3 questions. So we'll start with you.
Thank you for this lovely presentation. My question is actually to Richard Sennett. I really liked the example of Nehru Place, which was interesting about how these residual spaces can be converted, can become home to informality and sort of leads to democratic rights to people, to the city. But also we need to bear in mind that Nehru Place is in South Delhi, which is a posher and a safer neighborhood, in contrast to say North Delhi, Central Delhi, or Old Delhi, or Eastern Delhi, which is near Uttar Pradesh, which are unsafe, especially these informal spaces. And when I'm talking about unsafe, I'm talking about unsafety towards women. And this is something that I'm talking from experience as well. And that is counterintuitive in terms of democratic rights of women in these spaces. So informality sort of leading to infringing the democratic rights of women in these spaces. So and that's not just the case of Delhi, it's the case of most Indian cities, and Delhi being the most unsafest city for women in India. So I just want to know what are your thoughts on this?
We're going to take 3 questions, and then maybe Andy can answer. Okay.
Well, thank you for a wonderful discussion. When we talk about democracy, thank you for a wonderful discussion. When we talk about democracy, in addition to what she was talking about in terms of women's rights, it comes to my mind in terms of publicness and equality. So I think Richard and Miguel mentioned what design can facilitate publicness, either without designing too much of the program or trying to create the porous, cities or urban form. But how about equality in terms of equality of rights? If design, architecture, or urban form cannot have an impact on the dominance power structure, for example, the dominance power structure of capital these days, or other, power structure, then I know that Markus was talking about at least he was talking about he was trying to use ways to think about that some kind of impact on such a power structure. But to me, that impact can only be on the margin. So the question is, if we talk about equality as part of democracy, then how can we relate design or urban form to that element of democracy? Thank you.
Yeah. Regarding informality and housing, what I was interested in your discussion is how can we think of this informality housing as a valve scape for states that do not solve the issue of housing, and how can the states, either mostly in the global south, can use part of its money and resources to join forces with informality, so that informality is not this cycle of poverty that only separate higher and lower income. Thank you.
One more, and then I think, unfortunately, we do have to stop. Lena, so.
Thank you so much for a great discussion. My question would be, I think, to everyone here in the panel. I'm just curious, in your opinion, what do you think is the right scale to address particularly democracy and its issues in design? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go around. We can start with Richard. We've got gender, we've got equality, we've got housing, which in a way that's a link to a comment yesterday that I brought up about thinking about housing as, commodities and not just as places for living, so etc. And then the million-dollar question, which we won't be able to answer, but the next event about like the right scale. But if you want to say something about that, and we'll just do everyone just 2 minutes. We'll start with you, Richard.
Okay. To this lady in the back, I'd say you've raised a fundamental problem in democratic theory, which is, can you have democracy and inequality? And I believe you can. I really take issue with Michael Sandel about that. I think we need to have democratic practices that are not predicated on people being on equal plane. And we could discussed that for a lot. Question of scale is absolutely critical. All I can say about this is that most of my work has been the work that has been the most satisfying to me has been the work I've been doing the last 10 years, which is with local groups which are struggling with the problem of urban isolation and how to get out of the isolation of being ghettoized in cities. And and there are lots of local groups struggling with that. And that's the scale I think that, at least to me, is the most meaningful in terms of practice.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the questions. I mean, it's so bad we have 2 minutes to address them. Okay, so...
5 seconds.
yeah, can I grab your... No.
Yeah. Can you sell here? It's 5 seconds.
You know, the question of equality, right? I mean, from my position, I wish I had much more time to explain this. I'm hopefully going to convince Diane to come and talk more about this, but I think is very relevant. I mean, the premise is that under capitalism, equality does not exist, right? Simple as that. And I dare anyone to actually challenge me on that one because it's just unarguable, right? And that includes, of course, inequalities that were produced, you know, in terms of gender, race, you know, obviously class, right? That are predicated upon the forms in which capital has, you know, predated everything, you know, in our peoples and of course, nature. And so I guess the question should be posed in that direction is like, if we really want to even start imagining what democracy means, right? We should actually start imagining what an anti-capitalist future means. I mean, the largest question for me and for my partners, obviously for David, is that how to level up or live in today's society by having some part of your practice, because it's impossible to do it all, dreaming of an anti-capitalist future, right? The dream of an anti-capitalist future is, I guess, the planet needs this heavily. Independently of peoples, I don't know what are your political leanings, but I mean, our planet is gone, pretty much. And I don't know why isn't that such a, we're all not so enraged about the situation, right? It's almost like we have learned to naturalize the forms of destruction that we have created, that even in our own environment is uninhabitable. So I think that is the biggest dream, the biggest question. So I put it there. And then very fast and here, informality. Yes, I mean, that is a very interesting thing to discuss, and that we're discussing with several governments on this topic, in which forms can you empower informality without formalizing them? And that is a terrible question for both sides, because people that live in informal environments will have, thanks to all the publicity around, a desire for private property. So even if right now, for example, some governments that we're working with want to implement non-speculative cooperative kind of arrangements, when you are in the ground talking to people, they want just the private property. So it's really a double sort of scenario, which it's very complicated, but there's a path, and I think it's a very interesting path to work on these. Yeah, and the scale question will be later, I guess. Yeah.
Just to pick up on that, Miguel, I would say that the Community Development Corporation is maybe a good solution to people's desire for public property, because it is a communal private property in a sense. So, in terms of those questions, scale and what's the appropriate scale? I would say there is no appropriate scale. There is a need to attend to this at every scale, but every scale has its own set of problems. And the first step would be analyzing what those are. In terms of equality, I have a question for the questioner, which is, does the vulnerability of women in situations like the ones you describe translate into a higher degree of consciousness of the need to make change? And does it provoke change? I think the complaints about unsafe environments they contain in them also a requirement to do something about it. And I don't like to hear women complain about vulnerability if they're not doing something about it. Everybody's vulnerable in some way or other. What were the other questions?
Scale.
I answered that one.
Gender equality, unless you want to say something about housing informality. Otherwise, we'll
Yeah, Community Development Corporations.
Yeah.
Okay, so
What we call community land trust here in the United States. Yeah. Collective.
I'll end on scale. I think this was a very interesting question. And I absolutely agree with you. I don't think that there is one scale in particular that needs to be addressed, but it needs to be some kind of composite approach. But I do think that policy needs to play a role in this, and that it can't just be the kind of nitty-gritty. And what I would like to leave you with today is that I would really like to encourage one program at this school that actually tries to bring all of these things together, but in design. Thank you.
Okay, well, now that is a perfect segue to my final comment about today's panel. And I will just say something before we do a round of applause. But I just wanted to channel a little of the effort to look for optimism and hope in a very rich and serious, tough conversation about design and democracy. So I want to summarize it by trying to put the GSD at the center of kind of this deliberation, because I very much value, especially, well, everybody said something that allows me to try to put the GSD at the center as trying to dream for something different. So first of all, Claire, you had mentioned earlier that nobody does politics in studios, but I would like to say that we have tried. I've been involved in some studios. It's not the common studio class here, but it happens. So and
I exaggerate.
yes, you know. Well, and I also want to feel hopeful, and that's why there's so many people here about what we're trying to do with the GST. Then pick up on what Markus just said now, as well as before. The subtitle of his book is called The Horizontality of Spatial Politics, thinking about the potential for horizontality. We do have it here at the school. Maybe we're not activating enough the scales across the departments, but that is the promise of a place that has the different disciplines. These different disciplines work at different scales. So we have to talk to each other. And if there's one program, I'd love to see the MDes Publics doing that, but still we could do it as a school. And then last, taking Miguel's idea that once we get our act together and scale the horizontality in the GSD across our programs, we scale it out to society. And then we go out and take that message with us. But we have to start here before we get out there. So let's give a round of applause to this great panelist. And thank you for coming.